put her ring in my hands to keep me steady, and said, "Go." So I went. Do you ever regret that you went to war when you lie here suffering so? Never. I haven't done much, but I've shown I was willing to give my life. And perhaps I've got to. But I don't blame anybody. And if it was to do over again, I'd do it. I'm a little sorry I wasn't wounded in front. It looks cowardly to be shot in the back, but I obeyed orders. And it doesn't matter in the end, I know. Poor John. It did not matter now, except a shot in the front might have spared him the long agony in store for him. John seemed to read the thought that troubled me, as he spoke so hopefully when there was no hope. For he suddenly added, "This was my first battle. Do they think it's going to be my last?" I'm afraid they do, John. It was the hardest question I have ever been called upon to answer, made doubly hard by those clear eyes that forced a truthful answer by their own truth. John looked startled for a moment, pondered over the fateful fact, and then shook his head. "I'm not afraid, but it's difficult to believe all the same. I'm so strong. It doesn't seem possible for such a little wound to kill me." Mary Mercutio's dying words glanced through my memory as he spoke. "'Tis not so deep as a well, nor as wide as a church door, but 'tis enough." And John would have said the same had he seen the ominous black holes between his shoulders. He never had, and seeing the ghastly sights about him, could not believe his own wounds more fatal than these, for all the suffering that it caused him. "Shall I write to your mother now, John?" I asked, thinking that these sudden tidings might change all plans and preparations. But they did not. "No, ma'am. To Laurie, just the same. I'll break it to her best. And I'll add a line to her myself when you are done." And so I dictated the letter that he dictated, finding it better than any that I had ever sent. And as I sealed it, he said with a patient sort of sigh, "I hope the answer comes in time for me to see it." These things had happened 2 days before. Now John was dying, and the letter had not come. I have been called to many deathbeds before in my life, but none that made my heart ache as it did just then. As I went in, John stretched out his hands toward me. "I knew you'd come. I guess I'm moving on, ma'am." He was, and so rapidly that, even as he spoke, over his whole face I saw the gray veil fall that no human hand can lift. I went to him and, wiping the drops from his forehead, stirred the air about him with the wave of a fan, waiting to help him die. He stood in sore need of help, and there was so little that I could do. For as the doctor had foretold, The strong body rebelled against death and fought every inch of the way, forcing him to draw each breath with a spasm and clench his hands imploringly as if he asked, "How long must I endure this and be still?" For hours he suffered dumbly, without a moment's respite or a moment's murmuring. His limbs grew cold, his face damp, his lips white. Yet through it all, his eyes never lost their perfect serenity, and the man's soul seemed to sit therein, undaunted by the ills that vexed his flesh. One by one the men woke, and around the room appeared a circle of pale faces and watchful eyes, full of awe and pity. For though a stranger, John was beloved by all. Each man there had wondered at his patience, admired his fortitude, respected his piety, and now lamented his hard death. Presently, the wounded soldier David, who so loved John, came creeping from his bed for a last look and word. The kind soul was full of trouble as the choke in his voice, the grasp of his hand betrayed. Yet there were no tears, and the farewell of friends was the more touching for its brevity. "Old boy, how are you?" faltered David. "Most through, thank heaven," whispered John. "Can I say or do anything for you anywheres?" "Take my things home and tell them that I did my best." I will. Goodbye, David. Goodbye, John. Goodbye. They kissed then, as tenderly as women, and so parted. For poor David could not stay to see his love die. For a little while there was no sound in the room but the drip of water and John's distressful gasps as he breathed his life away. I had thought him nearly gone, and had just laid down the fan, thinking its help to no longer be needed, when John suddenly shot up in his bed and cried out a bitter cry that broke the silence. "For God's sake, give me air!" It was the only cry pain or death had brought from him, the only boon that he had asked. And we couldn't grant it, for all of the airs that blew were useless now. David flung open the first red streak of dawn was warming the gray east, a herald of the coming sun. John saw it, and with that love of light that lingers in us until the end, seemed to read in it a sign of hope, of help. For over his whole face broke that mysterious expression, brighter than any smile, which often comes to eyes that look their last. John laid himself gently down, and with stretching out his long right arm, as if to bring the blessed air to his lips in a fuller flow, he lapsed into a merciful unconsciousness, which assured us that for him suffering was forever past. He died there. For though the heavy breaths still tore their way up, they were but the waves of an ebbing tide that beat unfelt against the wreck, which an immortal voyager had abandoned with a smile. He never spoke again, but until the end held my hand close, so close that when he was asleep at last, I could not draw my own away. When they made him ready for the grave, John's body lay in state for half an hour, a thing that seldom happened in that busy place. Many came to see him, and I felt a tender sort of pride in my lost patient, for he looked a most heroic figure, lying stately and still as the statue of a brave knight asleep on his tomb. While we stood looking at him, the wardmaster handed me a letter saying that they had been forgotten the night before. It was John's letter, arrived just an hour too late to gladden the eyes that looked for it so eagerly. Yet he'd had it, for after cutting some brown locks to send to his mother, and taking his ring to send as well, telling how well the talisman had done its work, I placed the letter in his hands, still folded as when I pulled my own away, feeling that its place was there, and making myself happy with the thought that even in his solitary place in the hospital graveyard, he would not be without some token of the love that made life beautiful and outlives death. Then I left him, glad to have known so genuine a man, and carrying with me an enduring memory of the brave Virginia blacksmith as he lay serenely waiting for the dawn of that long day which knows no night. My dear girl, we shall have you sick in your bed unless you make yourself warm and comfortable for a little while. Your watch is now that the bed is comfortable, and have a vacation when you are back again. Now to be prudent in conscience, and have to add a periwinkle to my bouquet of patience. This advice was delivered in a paternal manner by the youngest surgeon in the ward, a kind-hearted gentleman who seemed to regard me frail young blossom that needed much cherishing instead of a tough old spinster who had been knocking about the world for 30 years. At the time I write of, he found me sitting on the stair, enjoying a good fit of coughing that made the application of a cool cloth both necessary and agreeable. As I waited for the frolicsome wind to restore the breath that I'd lost, cheering myself, meanwhile, with the secret conviction that pneumonia was waiting for me around the corner. His advice had been delivered by several people for a week and refused by me. But the last few hours had developed some unusual internal and external phenomena, which impressed upon me the fact that if I did not make a masterly retreat very soon, I should stumble down somewhere and have to be borne ignominiously from the field. My head felt like a cannonball. My feet had a tendency to cleave to the floor. The walls undulated in a most disagreeable manner. People looked unnaturally big, and the very bottles on the medicine shelf seemed to dance derisively before my eyes. Taking these things into consideration, all while blinking stupidly at Dr. Z, I resolved to retire gracefully, if I must. And so, with a valedictory to my boys, a private lecture to Mrs. Wadman, and the fervent wish that I could take off my soul and work in my body. I mournfully ascended up to my apartment, and Nurse Periwinkle was reported off duty. Shut up in my room with no books, spirits, or voices, that week was not a vacation by any means. Like a flock of friendly ravens, my sister nurses fed me not only with food for the body, but kind words for the mind. And from being half-starved, I found myself so petite and betoasted, so petted and served, that I was quite in the lap of luxury, in spite of cough, headache, a painful consciousness of the lungs, and a realizing sense of bones in the human frame. Whatever others may say or think, Nurse Periwinkle is forever grateful. I shall not regret the going, despite a sharp tussle with typhoid fever, for one can live and learn much in a month. A good fit of illness proves the value of health. Real danger tries one's mettle, and self-sacrifice sweetens character. The worth of life lies in the experiences that fill it, and this is one which cannot be forgotten. All that is best and bravest lies in the hearts of men and women, and though a hospital is a rough school, its lessons are both stern and salutary, and the humblest of pupils there, in proportion to their faithfulness, learns a deeper faith in God and in themselves. I, for one, would return tomorrow if I could, for the amount of pleasure and profit I got out of that 1 month compensates for all afterpangs. You ask if nurses are obliged to witness amputations as a part of their duty? I think not, unless they wish, for the soul is under the effects of ether and needs no care but such as the surgeons can best give. Our work begins afterward, when the poor soul comes to himself, sick, faint, and wandering, full of strange pains and confused visions, of disagreeable sights and sensations. Then we must tend and sustain, practicing and preaching patience, until sleep and time have restored courage and control. I witnessed several operations, for the height of my ambition was to go to the front after a battle, and feeling that the sooner I inured myself to trying sights, the more useful that I should be. Several of my mates shrunk from such things, for although the soul was wholly willing, the flesh was inconveniently weak. One funeral lady came to try her powers as a hospital nurse, and after a brief conversation eliciting the facts that she fainted at the sight of blood, was afraid to watch alone, couldn't possibly take care of delirious persons, was nervous about infection, and unable to bear much fatigue, she was mildly dismissed. I hope that she found her spear. To such as wish to know where these scenes took place, I must regretfully decline to answer, for Hurly-Burly House has ceased to exist as a hospital, so let it rest with all of its sins on its shoulders, or should I say chimney top. When the nurses felt ill, the doctors departed, and the patients got better, I believe that the concern gently faded from existence, or perhaps was merged into some other and better establishment, where I hope that the washing of 300 people is done outside, the food is edible, and mortal women are not expected to possess an angelic exemption from all wants, or the endurance of truck horses. Since the appearance of these hasty sketchings of my hospital life, I've heard from several of my comrades at the hospital, and their approval assures me that I have not let sympathy and fancy run away with me, as that lively team is apt to do when harnessed to a pen. As no two people can see the same things with the same eyes, my view of hospital life must be taken through my lens and held for what it is worth. Certainly nothing was set down in malice, and to the serious-minded party who objected to a tone of levity in some portions of the sketches, I can only say that it is part of my religion to look well after the cheerfulness of life, believing with good Sir Thomas More that it is wise to be merry in God. The next hospital I enter will, I hope, be one for the colored regiments. We owe them so large a debt, a little part of which I would be so proud to pay. Yours, with a firm faith in the good time coming. Tribulation, Periwinkle.
Wonderful. Awesome. Why don't you get our costume?